Hello there, those of you who have been here a while will know that for the past 2 years I have set myself the goal of reading one short story collection a month. So far that's been going really well. I don't think there's been any months where I haven't read a short story collection. There might have been one, but generally I've really enjoyed the process. I don't know if I could read more than one short story collection a month purely because they're a very different reading experience, but I've definitely been enjoying the experience of reading at least one. And I thought I would talk to you about a few of the collections that have really stuck out to me, because I think the more people that can read short story collections, the better. It's a very interesting reading experience. As I say, it's very different from reading a novel. Obviously, you can't get stuck in the way you would with a long book, but in a lot of ways, short stories are a completely different art form. They look at the world in a very different way. The world building doesn't necessarily have to be as on point, which is interestingly enough why I think magical realism especially works well in a short story, because you don't have to build the world, so the technicalities you don't have to worry about. You can focus on one bizarre event happening to somebody and it doesn't matter how it fits into the grand scheme of the world because it's just this isolated incident. I wanted to talk about some of the short stories, as I say, that really stuck out to me and just get people talking about short stories a little bit more, which I think is always good. So I'm going to start with Chekov. Now, Chekov is a classical writer of the short story. I think a lot of people would recognise his name and probably even recognise him when it comes to short stories. He's a Russian author who very much experimented with the form, and I think he came up with some really interesting things. Now, obviously, when you're reading classical short stories, they are kind of a different beast to what short stories are today. In the past, short stories have been much more sort of little novels rather than short stories that we know today. So there is that in here, but there is some really interesting discussions in this book. This is The Steppe and Other Stories, and I think it's sort of a collection of his most prominent stories, and they are also fascinating, and they look at very contemporary issues in obviously the 1800s. There's discussion of vegetarianism, for example, in here. There's discussion of the rich and poor divide, which I think is always relevant, and I would say he's well worth reading. If you want to get started in short stories, he may also be a good place to go, because he is kind of, as I say, little novels rather than short stories that we know today, so it might be quite a nice progression between reading a novel and reading a short story collection. I would, as I say, definitely recommend giving this guy a go. Then I've got two magical realism-y collections which really spoke to me. So we have got Broken Things by Padraic Tarrant. Now, I will say I adored this when I read it. I will link my individual review of this one down below. I absolutely loved it. I read it in one evening. It's only short and the stories are sort of no more than a page or two. I think the longest one is 5 pages if I remember rightly. So they're really punchy and they're really easy to get through. This basically looks at people on the outside of society, which looks at mental illness and, as I say, just people who have been rejected from society in one way or another and how they cope. And as I say, I did love this, but I find it very forgettable now. I couldn't really pick out predominant stories that stand out to me thinking back on it now. I would like to reread it because the writing in this is phenomenal. I have now got The Knife Drawer by Padraic Tarrant, which is her first novel, which I'm really excited to get to because I think she's such a talented author. And I'm kind of sad that the stories didn't stick with me, but they just didn't have that staying power. I think it may be because they were short. So you spend less time with them, so obviously they're going to have less of a long-lasting impact. And because it is such short stories, it's not too much of a commitment, so it might be quite interesting to try out, to test how you like short stories without putting in too much of a commitment. Then I have Vampires from the Lemon Grove by Karen Russell. This is the only short story collection of hers I have read, but I hear her other one, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, is better. I know that's the one that a lot of people talk about, and this one sort of seems too pale in comparison, but I found this absolutely beautiful. Now, Karen Russell is about as dense with short stories as you can get, but she's so fantastic and she has such innovative ideas. There's so many good stories in here. I think there was only one that sort of didn't really stick with me, which was about Pane of Glass. I wasn't fully paying attention, so I think that might be why I didn't enjoy it. Now, Karen Russell is a really weird one because in terms of technical ability, she's really on the verge of overwriting, and I mean, to test this I actually went on a website that writers use called Hemingway app, which is basically, it is a place where you can paste your writing and it looks at the readability of that writing. So if it's kind of hard to read, your writing will be highlighted in yellow. If it's completely illegible. Basically it would be highlighted in red, and the whole extract that I pasted was highlighted in red, and she got the worst score that you could get, and yet she is amazing and she is so good to read and she's so talented. And I think that's the pure test of a really talented author, is when they're kind of doing completely different things with language and things that should, in all honesty, be bad, but they are so good to read, and she's so easy to read for me. I think she's well worth trying out if you are so inclined. And then I have The Rental Heart and Other Stories by Kirsty Logan. I wanted to mention this one because it's a collection that I had quite an interesting experience with. So The Rental Heart itself is an amazing story about the idea that you buy a sort of metal heart basically from a shop, and then every time you get your heart broken you can take it back and replace it and start again, which I really loved that story. But the other stories in here kind of didn't speak to me. However, I took a break from it and then I went back and started reading them again, and I really enjoyed them. There are some really lovely stories in here, and Kirsty Logan's writing is really inspiring. I find her quite inspiring as a person, I think maybe because she's closer to my age range than a lot of writers. But I would definitely say this is worth a read. Again, it's a short one, so it's quite a good one to start with, and I know a lot of people who don't necessarily read that many short story collections have spoken about this one and said they enjoyed it, so again it might be quite a nice place to start. And I have some realist short stories. Now, when I first started my short story journey I very much read more realism stuff, whereas now I very much gravitate towards magical realism collections. But one person that I really started with was Laurie Moore. I have got Self-Help here and Birds of America. I have also recently read her most recent collection called Bark, which I didn't get along with, but these two I very much enjoyed, and I would quite like to reread them now that I've had sort of the experience of the other short story collections that I've read, because it would be interesting to see how I re-experienced these. I think this is probably a criticism that comes mainly from having read more things, but she does focus on sort of white privileged women going through white privileged women problems, you know, having breakdowns or trying to deal with the idea of growing older or trying to deal with the idea of having children. She does very much focus on these themes, but she does it very well, and I think these are good ones to start. If you're in your 20s and you're kind of struggling with that, I think these are really excellent, especially Self-Help. Although it's her first collection and people's first collections are usually a little bit dodgy, I would say this was my favourite. Birds of America has some stories in there that are very long, like 50-60 pages long, and I do prefer short punchy short stories, which is more what you get in Self-Help. So there's those ones. And then one that I know is not particularly popular among a huge deal of people is Miranda July's No One Belongs Here More Than You. I read this last year, and I have to say the way I read it and the time in which I read it probably very much affected my experience with this collection. So I read it during the readathon last year, so I read it in one complete sitting. And I also read it when my life was going through a bit of a dodgy patch, so it kind of really spoke to me. Again, in the same way that Laurie Moore kind of focuses on privileged white women going through privileged white women problems, so does this, but it's just punchy. I just enjoy Miranda July's writing. I think she's got a really interesting take on things. I would say this definitely isn't for everyone, but it is something that I really enjoyed, and I think Miranda July's writing is fascinating and well worth reading. So those are just a few of the favourite collections that I have found over the time that I've been reading short story collections, but I'm sure there are going to be many more, and I'm looking forward to continuing with my short story journey. I've got some more on my shelf that I'm really excited to get to, including Michelle Faber's The Apple I'm really excited for. I've also got a Kelly Link collection because I feel like I need a bit of Kelly Link in my life and I just haven't ever got round to it, so I'm very much looking forward to that. And I've also got two short story collections that came in the Moth Box last month, which I'm really incredibly excited to get to both of those as well. So let me know down below any of your favourite short story collections, and I will see you next time. Bye!